the reason why this meeting is important is because this is, I think, the fun bit. This is where we get to discuss what the strategies are for fighting racism, getting rid of racism in society, and how do we achieve it? How can we learn from what's happened in history to inform what we say and do as revolutionaries? And I think we have to always learn from the high points in struggle to try and inform us about what we do next. But we at an interesting point now, I suppose, where we're living through times where there is a failure from the system to come up with any sort of solution. Those that believe that somehow, through education we would eventually eradicate racism through a period of time, and we all read The Guardian, and eventually we'd get to a point where we wouldn't be racist anymore, or being taught in integrated schools, or people eating chicken tikka masala would eventually arrive at the promised land. Those things don't, actually racism is getting worse for people, not better at this point. So these things aren't directly related in time. Or I suppose if you looked at what Brian's mentioned earlier in the day, the idea that somehow if we actually get the right black people in the right positions of leadership, you can't do better than having the President of America, can you? And yet the same issues arise about actually what did he do when black people were getting slaughtered, or continue to be slaughtered in the streets by racist police officers. So that's why this discussion is important, and I'm going to have to try and trip through quite a considerable amount of history. I'm going to try and look at what happened in the 30s with the Communist Party, both in Harlem and Alabama. Look at the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Panther Party, and hopefully we'll end up with some sort of discussion around what we do now, Ferguson, Black Lives Matter, and everything else. So we've got a lot to get through. Where do I start? I suppose I'm going to start in I suppose, post-World War I revolutionary Russia and the impact it had around the world for people, and including black people from America, a few of them who grasped immediately the potential of looking at a different sort of world and how it's organised. The opportunity to see a society that had got rid of oppression, that treated people on equal basis, obviously would be attractive to anyone that wanted to see the end of prejudice. And I suppose a minority of black workers in America saw that and started to get involved in the Communist Party in America at that time. And the Communist Party of America developed an understanding that they saw black workers as being central to building the fight both against racism and capitalism in America. Obviously, over this period that we're going to look at, it was hampered by Stalinist foreign policy, the Stalinist grip on Russia. Nevertheless, people that joined the Communist Party of America in those days often did so for the right reasons, wanted to confront capitalism, and therefore were attracted for that very reason, that idea that there was a different sort of society possible, and they wished to be involved in real struggles that took place to try and change those. And some of the campaigns that they got involved in, particularly during the 30s, around unemployment, poor housing, police violence, all these things will be familiar to us today still, are things that they started to develop. And by the end of the 30s, in Harlem alone, the Communist Party had over 1,000 members in Harlem alone. It's difficult to, and there's a book, I'm not brought it with me because my bag was getting too heavy, but there's a book by Martin Nason on communists in Harlem in the 30s. I'd recommend, if you've not read it, have a look out for it. The other book for the 30s that I'd recommend is this one, The Hammer and the Hoe, that goes through the personal accounts of one Communist Party member, Hosea Hudson, who actually accounted everything that he did. Some of the stuff he kept is incredible. It is, and you may not be able to read it, it is one of the leaflets the Ku Klux Klan gave out about the Communist Party in the 30s. Negroes beware, do not attend communist meetings. Paid organised for the communists are trying to get Negroes in trouble. Alabama is a good place for good Negroes to live in, but it's a bad place for Negroes who believe in social equality. There you go. The Ku Klux Klan is watching you, right? Yeah. So it gives you an idea, I suppose, about the situation that they tried to organise in. The first meeting that they tried to hold in about 1930 in Birmingham, Alabama, 200 people turned up. I think it was called around the idea of trade union unity. 3/4 of the audience were black, and they were addressed by 3 speakers who obviously talked about their opposition to lynching, which is prevalent at that time. They talked about the opposition to the fight for a decent wage because what had happened in the South is post the battle in terms of who won the Confederacy versus in terms of a united republic in America. In terms of that battle, when they got rid of slavery, it led to a growth of a populist quiet movement that brought black and white workers together. The bosses then instituted Jim Crow to try and smash that unity and to try and force divisions between black and white workers. And so in that context, it was a horrific place to try and organise and to try and make a difference. I mean, that meeting attracted 200 workers. That sounds an excellent start to set off. One of the 3 speakers' house was firebombed after that meeting, and the Communist Party decided for 2 months they had to go underground and not do anything for fear of what happened to them. And they had to develop a way of organising the South that went under the radar. They, in effect, were an underground organisation. They thought of all novel ways to distribute handbills and leaflets to build their organisation on the ground, to do things. So that's why it's very difficult to say how big an influence that their organisation had, but clearly it had a huge influence in many of the battles and many of the union battles that took place, particularly the Sharecroppers Union and other organisations that fought a battle for decent wages and rights. One Communist Party member had a situation where he was being pursued by bailiffs. Obviously, debt, even in Ferguson, still today, debt is one way that they try and control you in terms of racism. And he'd accumulated a number of debts. The landlord came to get his money. He brought the sheriff with him. There was 4 of them. He was ready with 19 people, all with guns. The sheriff beat a hasty retreat, but he obviously came back fully tooled up and armed, and a gunshot, a gun battle ensued. The Communist Party organiser got shot, and he managed to walk 17 miles to the nearest hospital. And once the doctor treated him, he handed him straight over to the police. And then the landlord and the Ku Klux Klan and others got hold of the Communist Party list for that area, and you can imagine what happened to them subsequently for that. It was those sort of acts of heroism, I suppose, that people encountered in trying to organise themselves. But nevertheless, it didn't stop the momentum forward in terms of actually people realising that actually the communists were people who were willing to stand up for them, that were willing to fight for their rights and even put their life on their line to try and create a better society and a better world. And they were able to do that in even with those levels of oppression. In Harlem at the same time, and these obviously things were linked. I mean, one of the main campaigns that brought the whole movement to the Communist Party and its popularity to a head in the 30s was around the Scottsboro Boys. The Scottsboro Boys were 9 young men aged between 13 and 21 who were accused of raping 2 women on a train. They hadn't done it. That didn't stop the courts finding them guilty. What usually happens in America in those times, if they believed that you were guilty, it was allowed to in a sense, formally lynch you, kill you, without the need to go through the trial and all that. We don't need to do all that. We can just go away and do that. The communists intervened in that immediately offered them legal support, stopped the lynching taking place, and actually organised a defence campaign. And it's probably something that we would mirror in terms of if we were organising a defence campaign for someone and we're involved in offering our strategy and guidance for them about how they do that. If you looked at the Tottenham 3 or Wilson Silcott campaign, it's the idea that it's not just based on some legal defence. They had a legal defence. It was based on mass activity of going around, speaking around the countries, organising mass meetings, getting the parents of those kids to go around. The Communist Party did all that. They visited Harlem, they went to all the churches, and they met some political competition from that. The NAACP, who were the conservative black organisation at its time, didn't want to have anything to do with the communists, didn't know what to do about the fact that the communists were leading this campaign. They refused to take the case initially because they were worried about being associated with a rape. You know, the communists stepped in immediately and saw the fact that it was a battle against racism and immediately stepped in. The Garveyites, which was very popular in the 20s, also went into the 30s. The idea that of Garveyism was that you had had to be proud of your black race, and within that there was arguments that went on around where black people should live. You know, what should their rights be? His argument was that they should go back to Africa, that they should hire a liner, which he did and paid for, to try and send people back to where they came from. The communists argued, and we can debate whether this was the right thing or not, argued that there should be a black belt, which was controlled as part of self-determination for black people. I think it was an interesting thing, not that it ever took hold, because it wouldn't be very difficult to construct, but actually it meant that black people belonged in America, deserved the right to live there, and actually meant they were fighting for their rights. And I think in many ways was a positive in terms of how they approached it. Now, these political debates were always ongoing, and the tension between these different arguments. But it became clearer as the 30s went on in response to the economic crisis that Garveyism didn't really offer a way forward for the majority of black workers. In fact, Garvey became more and more in tune with his own version of black capitalism, as it were. He talked about capitalism is necessary for the progress of the world. He argued his follows against communism and the pitfalls of white trade unionism, opposed social equality and intermarriage. He declared himself in favour of pure black race, just as self-respecting whites are in favour of pure white race, and called black leaders of mixed ancestry as mongrels. So his language deteriorated those people. Actually, people could see that more and more the communists had more and more of a sway in influencing how people thought. They saw that the NAACP was turned into some sort of Uncle Tom organisation that didn't want to represent people. They saw the black nationalist offer of the time under Marcus Garvey as being one that was limited in terms of what he was willing to offer. Beyond the idea of black pride, it wasn't willing to offer any sort of opposition to the capitalist system that was exploiting both black and white workers. And particularly in Harlem, the communists were able to show a real difference from what their strategies would mean on the ground in terms of real struggle. So the Garveyites wanted to organise a don't buy from where you don't work campaign. And in essence what they were saying is that you need to sack the white workers in that department store and you need to replace them with black workers. Successfully, the communists, through working with the unions inside those workplaces, as well as putting pressures on the bosses from outside those workplaces, were able to recruit black workers and white workers, and to get them to take on extra workers for those places, rather than be stuck in a campaign which would have been divisive and wouldn't have caused unity. And in particular, over battles against imperialism, it really did make a huge difference, their involvement. This was over Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia. It led to various calls of the Garveyite movement to not use Italian shops. Somehow all Italians are to blame for Mussolini's would have been the nationalist argument. What the communists were able to do was to organise Italian workers as well as black workers together to march through. I think the 25,000 people marched through Harlem to oppose Mussolini's war, and from a newspaper at the time, the Amsterdam News, quoted the demo by saying, "When white workers march in such numbers, in such cordiality through a Negro neighbourhood, is something to think very deeply about." So it showed in practice actually the class unity that could be fostered. And the only other thing I'm going to say about the 30s is that it wasn't just those political campaigns. there was a cultural element to it as well. You know, if you read books around people like Duke Ellington, Dizzy Gillespie, these people were card-carrying members of the Communist Party in the 30s. They did gigs for the Scottsboro Boys. They did all the things you imagine about what we would do in terms of putting a cultural front on, like we were talking about love music racism. Those sort of things were very much part of what the communists put on the 30s. Obviously, unfortunately, if you end up backing a Nazi in the Second World War, it's going to discredit a lot of your supporters. You know, if you come to the point where Stalin tells you that he wants to have a pact with Hitler to save Russia, it isn't going to go down very well with activists who want to fight against imperialism, is it? And that's the unfortunate thing about the Communist Party and what happened to those activists. But many of those people, like Dizzy Gillespie and others, pop up again in the 60s with others. Then again, Max Roach, John Coltrane, they all come back in the 60s again to be involved in the civil rights movement of the time, and are a powerful voice. You know, one of the expressions I think that's great about the anti-race movement, that it goes with very good food and very good culture, doesn't it? Every opportunity, and very good music. If we looked at the experience post World War II, I mean, there's some people that do straddle it. The only one that does straddle it that is well worth reading about is Paul Robeson. A magnificent fighter, both in the 30s, again, so closely associated with the Communist Party, Edgar Hoover took special interest in trying to break his resistance, and unfortunately succeeded in the end. But actually, it shows that there was a link in terms of movement between what happened in the 30s and then what was to happen later. I mean, I think I read that. I think Dizzy Gillespie was one of the people that refused to get up on a bus in the 30s, and then the Communist Party organised campaign in the 30s in the South for a white person and got arrested. So there was a tradition that carried on that went into the civil rights movement. I'm not going to talk long about the civil rights movement because I'm not going to run out of time. But obviously, many of the tactics that were started used by the Communist Party in the 30s were used again to even greater effect under the civil rights movement, under people like Martin Luther King from the Southern Conference leadership, a religious-based movement that actually brought churches together to support people that are doing bus boycotts, sit-ins. You know, people the idea of having integrated lunch counters. There's a famous story, no one knows whether it's really true or not, but Muhammad Ali used to tell it, didn't he? Where he came back from the Olympics, where he went to the local diner because he'd won a gold medal at the Olympics, and he expected people then to be able to eat a burger at the local burger shop, and they wouldn't let him in because wouldn't let him sit down and eat because he was black, so he threw his medal in the river. Who knows whether it's true or not, but he loved telling it. My dad loved telling it to me when I was a kid. But it gives you an example, I suppose, of the sort of campaign and how wide it went. I mean, in terms of the amount of people between autumn 61 and spring 63, 20,000 men, women, children were arrested in those campaigns. The problem, the two things that make the strategy of Martin Luther King and others stand out is, one was their adherence to non-violence. The other was the idea that somehow by putting pressure on the Democratic Party, you could eventually make gains to get some sort of equality within America. Both of them became heavily criticised within the movement as seeing that, and the person that represented most in terms of criticism of those strategies was Malcolm X. Very clearly, he argued that actually racism needed to be fought by any means necessary, that you needed to be able to defend yourself, be courteous, obey the law. If someone puts a hand on you, send them to the cemetery. He didn't literally mean it, but actually what he meant is that we no longer should we put up with non-violence as a way of dealing with racism. We have every right to defend ourselves in any way we form. The other part of Malcolm X was that there was no illusion that the Democrat or Republican machine could be used for any other, that they served the purposes of the ruling class and of capitalism. The famous statement that got him kicked out of the Nation of Islam was that he viewed the death of JFK as the chickens coming home to roost. It never did make him sad. It made all of us glad. And it summed up a feeling that actually a violent society that he represented was the cause of his death. That's what he was saying, and very much a harder sell. And out of his death, both him, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X were killed because they were a threat to American society and American capital. It led to the growth, the basis of the growth of the Black Panther Party. It grew off the huge resistance that broke up, that develops. I suppose, if you go through a non-violent way of trying to change society, and that person is killed by the American state, or that's what people believe, then actually what is the point anymore? And there was huge uprisings in Detroit, in Los Angeles, in other places where people started to fight back by revolution. Yeah, I can see the clock ticking away. At its height, the Black Panther Party, 25% of the black population had great respect for the Black Panther Party. 43% of those under 21 supposedly supported them. They had a 10-point programme, and as I mentioned earlier, they rose to fame by the stunt they pulled at Sacramento, which scared the shit out of Ronald Reagan. They went on to stand. One of their leaders when Eldridge Cleaver went on to stand against Ronald Reagan in a governorship in California, and they recount. I haven't got time now because I'm running out of time, but they recount a story against worth reading. If you have a chance, it is worth going through Bobby Seale's book. It's written how he talks properly, but it gives you a flavour, I suppose, of the resistance to that. And I think there's one meeting he goes to at a Catholic school where he managed to get the whole of the school that are all training to be nuns to shout 1, 2, 3, 4, fuck Ronald Reagan together for a few minutes. It gives you a sense of the feelings of the time. And if you look at their 10-point programme, it calls for a revolutionary overthrow of society. It calls for that sort of change to happen. Finally, I'm going to mention very briefly the illegal revolutionary workers. They came out the car plants in the north, in Detroit, and other places. They suffered. They recognised that actually, even though they had formal equality in the north, they didn't have any sort of real meaningful equality. They suffered the same police brutality, the same poor housing. They used to call the working on the line in these car plants niggermation, because they were the first ones, a slight automation, because actually they were put in the most dangerous jobs. They often used to end up losing their limbs, being killed in the car plant, just being put on the most dangerous jobs possible. And to give you a sense of, I suppose, what that was like, there was a newspaper in Detroit called Inner City Voice that again, there's a book, Detroit, If You Don't Mind Dying, you can, again, worth reading. And they brought out a newspaper in the City Voice, and the first one they called it Michigan Slavery. In the July Rebellion, we administered a bit. This is what the newspaper first newspaper said. In the July Rebellion, which was when they had an uprising, we administered a beating to the behind of the white power structure, but apparently our message didn't get over. We are still working too hard, getting paid too little, living in bad housing, sending our kids to substandard schools, paying too much for groceries, and treated like dogs by the police. We still don't own anything, control anything. In other words, we're still being systematically exploited by the system, and we have a responsibility to break the back of that system. And then they go on to talk about the need for revolution. And I suppose I'm going to have to stop at this point, but obviously we need to discuss, where did that movement go to? What happened to that? Did it move into the idea of black leadership? What's happened to that idea now? And what strategies do we need to take from what happened in the past to use for struggles for the future?